So you're worried that your show might not be interesting, that people might not listen, that you might be boring. No doubt. So what we're going to talk about today is what makes a good podcast.
This program is brought to you by thepodcastfactory.com.
Hey, producer Jonathan here from The Podcast Factory. Welcome to another video, and today we're going to talk about what makes a good podcast. So a lot of times people jump in and they make some really common mistakes when starting their podcast. They don't really think about their audience. They don't think about their topics. They don't think about their goals. And so what happens is they launch into a podcast, they buy all the cool equipment, they get all the great software, they get the cover art, and nobody listens to their show. So here is what makes a good podcast. It's very simple. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you know who your audience is. So research who they are, where they hang out, what they like, what they don't like, what their problems are, what they need help with. And that'll give you a good idea, number one, of how to make your podcast interesting. Number two, have decent equipment. So look, you can't start a podcast with a headset. And I know people out there talk about that all the time. But look, you need to have a decent mic. You need to have decent quality sound, and you need to make sure that it's pleasing to the ear when people listen to it. And I'm not saying that you have to spend hundreds or thousands of bucks, but at least $50 on a decent mic will do you good. So one of the favorite podcaster mics out there that's about $60 is this AudioTechnica 2100, either USB or regular plug. It comes with all that stuff in the box. This is a great way to sound excellent and still be on a budget. And so the last thing that you need to know to have a great podcast is be consistent. There's nothing worse than listening to a show, getting hooked on it, and then wondering, hey, when's the next one coming out? When's the next one coming out? The next one never comes out. So the other part of having a great podcast is be consistent. Show up when you say you're going to show up. If you're doing a weekly show, then show up every week. If you're doing a daily show, I feel bad for you, but show up every day. So those are the three things that you really need to think about when you want to launch your podcast and make sure that it's good. Is make sure you know your audience so that you can speak to the topics that they want to hear about. Make sure that you have decent equipment so that you sound good, and make sure that you're consistent. All right, so that's it for today's video. If you need help being consistent, sounding great, and never being boring, the Podcast Factory is here to help. I'm producer Jonathan. I produce all the shows over at the Podcast Factory, so come on over and check us out. And remember, if you want more tips like this one, subscribe to our channel, thepodcastfactory.com/YouTube. Podcast, what makes a good podcast? I should be talking about what makes good handwriting. I always wanted to do this. Take one. Dirk.
This program is brought to you by thepodcastfactory.com.